Ethan Cole opened his eyes in the darkness of the basement and immediately looked at his hands. His fingers were intact. His skin showed no signs of burns. He sat down on the cold concrete floor and exhaled slowly. Upstairs, a civil defense siren was wailing. That meant today was the third day since the fog had rolled in. That meant he had time until dawn. He stood up and turned on his flashlight. The basement of his house on the outskirts of Greyhall looked pitiful. 6 by 8 meters, a tool rack, a bag of cement, an old generator. Ethan knew the value of this basement better than anyone in town. He touched the wall and a translucent panel flashed before his eyes. Shelter registered. Owner, Ethan Call. Level 1, durability, 100 units. Available upgrades unlocked with cores. Ethan stared at the panel and his palms grew clammy. Everything matched, every line, every number. He pulled 3 dull gray cores from his jacket pocket. He'd collected them an hour ago from the bodies of those rat-like creatures in the alley. An ordinary person would still be afraid to leave the house on the third day. Ethan wasn't ordinary. He knew the flock's roots. He knew that gray cores were cheap now but would be worth a life in a month. He inserted the cores into the panel and selected an upgrade. First order wall reinforcement. Cost 3 gray cores. Construction time 4 hours. The panel flashed. Pale lines of light crept up the walls. A new line appeared at the bottom of the panel. Shelter experience. 30 units. 70 left until level 2. Ethan sat down on a crate and waited. He knew how to wait. In his previous life, he'd spent 12 years testing other people's programs for bugs, and patience had been his craft. The thought came and went. Something else was more important right now. 10 minutes later, he heard a scraping sound upstairs, claws against the garage's steel door. The creature was looking for a way in. The upgrade was only halfway complete, and the walls were still just plain concrete. Ethan cursed under his breath and opened the panel to check its strength. His finger slipped. He accidentally pressed the cancel construction button. The panel asked for confirmation. He was about to close the window when his gaze caught the fine print at the bottom. Materials will be returned to the owner. Ethan froze. There wasn't a word about experience in the text. In that life, he'd found hundreds of such loopholes in the code. An unwritten condition? A forgotten variable. His heart began to race. The screeching upstairs stopped, and the creature went off in search of easier prey. Ethan pressed confirm. The light on the walls went out. 3 gray cores rolled out of the panel into his palm. He slowly looked up at the experience bar. 30 units. The experience remained. Ethan stood motionless for nearly a minute. Then he laughed a quiet, dry laugh, the laugh of a man who had found a crack in the foundation of the world. He inserted the cores again. He ran the reinforcement process again. The panel credited him with another 30 units of experience. He canceled the construction. The cores returned. The experience remained. 60 units. He repeated the cycle a third time, and the panel lit up solemnly in gold. The shelter had reached level 2. Access to the living module and storage was now open. Durability, 200 units. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead. 3 cheap cores, 15 minutes, level 2. His neighbor, the merchant Barrett Hale, had boasted to the whole street yesterday that he'd reach level 2 by the end of the month and be the first in the neighborhood. Ethan started the cycle again. Investment, accrual, cancel, refund. He worked like a machine. His fingers flew across the panel. Experience trickled in steady increments of 30 units. An hour later, the shelter reached level 3, and the panel offered a downward expansion. The basement could expand underground. Ethan confirmed the excavation of the first underground level, and this time did not cancel the order. The floor in the corner split open, and a spiral staircase made of gray system stone led downward. He descended and found himself in an empty hall 20 by 20 meters. The walls glowed with an even white light. Ethan stood in the middle of the hall and for the first time in a very long time allowed himself to smile genuinely. Then he went back upstairs and continued the cycle. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the experience had become too much for him to process. Level 4. Level 5. At level 5, the panel flickered and displayed a line Ethan had never seen before. Non-standard owner behavior detected? Anomaly indicator, 1%. Ethan stopped pressing the panel. He reread the line 4 times. In that life, he hadn't just been looking for bugs. He also knew what happened to those who used them too greedily. He closed the panel and forced himself to stop. 5 levels in a single night, enough for a start. The sky was already turning gray above. Ethan walked up to the exit and cracked the door open. Barrett Hale was walking down the street with the crossbow slung over his shoulder and 2 gray projectiles clenched in his fist. Barrett spotted Ethan and grimaced. He said he was surprised that the quiet neighbor from the house at the end of the street had even made it to the 3rd day. He asked what level his shelter was at. Ethan replied that the shelter was growing little by little. Barrett chuckled and declared that little by little in the New World meant a grave. He boasted that his shop was fortified almost to level 2 and that in a month the whole neighborhood would be buying water from him. Ethan nodded and wished him luck. Barrett walked away, pleased with himself. Ethan closed the door and looked at the panel. Level 5. Anomaly, 1%. Somewhere deep inside, a thought was taking shape, that this 1% would one day become a countdown timer. He pushed the thought aside. First, he had to survive the first wave. It would arrive in 4 days and wipe out 1/3 of the district. In his previous life, he'd seen it with his own eyes through a crack in someone else's shelter where they'd let him in exchange for his last can of food. Ethan clenched his fists and unclenched them. Now, everything would be different. He went down to the underground level and began marking out a spot for a water tank. He didn't have enough cores. That meant in the morning, he'd have to go hunting at the old pump station where a pack of night dogs had made their nest. An ordinary 5th-day hunter wouldn't have set foot there, not even for a mountain course. Ethan knew the alpha's blind spot and knew that the dogs couldn't sense a person standing in running water. He packed his backpack. He checked his crowbar and a bundle of homemade harpoons. Before heading out, he cast one last glance at the panel. The anomaly reading hung at the bottom like a thin red thread, 1%. Ethan stepped out into the gray dawn, and the shelter door closed softly behind him. The street greeted him with the smell of smoke and wet ash. In the distance, above the center of Greyhall, a column of black smoke rose. The city was dying according to a schedule Ethan knew by heart. He walked briskly along the fences, counting in his head. The pack at the pumping station would yield 8 gray cores and 1 green one. The green core would unlock the blueprint for a water filter. The filter would give him a commodity that in a week would be worth more than gold, and the cycle of investment and cancellation would turn every core into a step upward. He turned toward the river and heard a low growl ahead. The pack had gone out hunting ahead of schedule. The schedule was starting to slip. Ethan slung his harpoon off his shoulder and stepped into the cold water. A system error had given him a head start, but the world around him was no longer moving quite as it had in his memory, and that was the first real problem. Ethan Call had returned on the 3rd day of the apocalypse and accidentally discovered that undoing a shelter upgrade returns the cores but leaves the experience. Overnight, he had upgraded the shelter from level 1 to level 5 and achieved an anomaly rating of 1%. He was preparing for the first wave of monsters in 4 days. His neighbor, Barrett Hale, thought he was a wimp. Events were already diverging from his memories of his past life. The pack at the pumping station had emerged ahead of schedule. The water was freezing and the current tugged at his legs. Ethan stood knee-deep in the river near the concrete outlet of the pumping station and didn't move. The night hounds came ashore 30 meters away from him. 7 creatures the size of a calf, black fur, white eyes without pupils. The alpha raised its snout and sniffed the air. Ethan remembered that running water masks the scent of a human. He remembered this from a story he'd heard a month before his death. Now, that knowledge was keeping him alive. The alpha turned away. The pack moved along the bank toward the residential neighborhoods. Ethan waited and threw his first harpoon. The tip of the harpoon pierced the last dog's shoulder blade. The creature yelped and the pack spun around. From then on, speed was everything. Ethan retreated deeper into the water until it reached his waist. The dogs were afraid of the current. They darted along the water's edge and growled, while he methodically fired harpoons from 10 paces away. The fourth dog managed to leap, and its claws slashed Ethan's shoulder. He dove underwater and struck the soft throat from below with a crowbar. By dawn, 7 carcasses lay on the shore. Ethan carved out the testicles with fingers numb from the cold. 8 gray ones and 1 green one, just as he had expected. His shoulder was burning. He bandaged the wound with a piece of his shirt and took the long way home through the backyards. At the turn onto his street, he stopped. 3 men were standing near his house, burly guys with pipes and one with a rifle. Ethan recognized the rifle before he recognized the owner's face. Kroger Dan, the owner of the auto repair shop at the southern end of the neighborhood. In that life, by the end of the first month, Kroger had all the nearby hideouts under his control and was taking bullets from people in exchange for the right to live. Now he was just getting started. Kroger saw Ethan and grinned. He said there was a rumor going around the neighborhood about a basement that had lit up with a system stone overnight. He said miracles like that needed to be investigated. He suggested Ethan show him the shelter and pay a protection fee, 5 cores a week. Ethan looked at the gun, then at the pipes, then at his door. He replied that he'd think about it until evening. Kroger laughed and said he'd come back for an answer that evening and that the basement door wouldn't save him from the fire. The trio left. Ethan went inside and locked the 3 bolts behind him. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from anger. He went downstairs and dumped the cores in front of the panel. 9 of them. In that life, he'd seen what Kroger did to those who refused to comply. So by evening, the shelter would have to become a fortress. Ethan began the cycle. Injection. Cancel. Return. Experience points flowed steadily. Level 6 unlocked the outer armor plates. Level 7 unlocked the automatic bolt and the viewing slits made of system glass. The anomaly indicator crept up to 4%, and with each spike, the panel flashed red just a little longer. Ethan forced himself not to think about it. He spent a green core on a blueprint for a water filter and started construction without canceling. Then he went upstairs and waited for evening. Evening brought not Kroger, the evening brought screams. Ethan pressed his face against the viewing slit. People were running down the street. A wave of gray bodies was moving behind them. The rat-like creatures were streaming in a dense tide, and there were hundreds of them. The first wave had arrived 4 days early. The schedule wasn't just slipping. The schedule had collapsed. Ethan stood motionless for a second. Then he opened the door. In that other life, a door just like this had once been shut in his face. He remembered the sound of the bolt on the other side, better than he remembered his mother's face. He pulled the first woman and her child inside. Then an old man, then a family from the house across the street. People tumbled down the stairs to the underground level, and the hall filled with crying and heavy breathing. Barrett Hale was the last to reach the door. His shop was on fire. His crossbow was empty. Blood from a slit eyebrow was streaming down his face. He saw Ethan in the opening of the 7th level armored door, and his eyes grew huge. He stared silently at the plates of the system armor, at the white glow coming from the depths, at the spiral staircase leading downward. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and slammed the door shut. Outside, the first bodies slammed into the armor. The shelter didn't even flinch. Barrett slid down the wall onto the floor and kept looking around. He quietly asked how, just how. He said he'd been leveling up to the 2nd tier for a whole week and considered himself the fastest in the neighborhood. Ethan replied that he'd worked hard. Barrett laughed nervously and fell silent. All night long, a wave of creatures raged outside. They gnawed at the armor and died beneath the automatic spikes of the outer perimeter. By morning, the flood had subsided. Ethan opened the door and stepped out onto the pockmarked street. A pile of gray carcasses lay in front of the shelter. People followed him out and silently gathered the cores. The hall was enormous. 42 gray cores and 4 green ones. The survivors looked at Ethan as if he were a wall that had shielded them from death. An old man from the 1st tier said that their entire neighborhood had burned down and that they had nowhere else to go. Ethan scanned the 24 people. Extra mouths to feed, extra noise, at the same time, extra hands, eyes, guards. He said there was enough room downstairs for anyone willing to work. The crowd began to murmur. Barrett was the last to approach. He was crumpling his hat in his hands and wouldn't look up. He said his shop had burned down, but he knew how to trade better than anyone else on this side of the river. He offered to manage the warehouse. Ethan nodded. Yesterday's mocker became the first officer of his refuge. By noon, Kroger appeared on the street with a dozen fighters. He saw a mountain of carcasses. Level 7 armor. People hauling supplies to the safety of the basement. His jaw moved slowly, like that of a man mentally reviewing all his plans. He didn't demand a contribution. He said he'd come to propose an alliance with the neighbors. Ethan replied that he'd think about it. Kroger left, his back tense as a string. Barrett watched him go and noticed that people like that don't offer alliances. People like that come to sharpen their knives. Ethan agreed. That evening, he went down to the lower hall and opened the control panel. The wave experiment and the cycle of cancellations had raised the shelter to level 9. Beneath the first tier now lay 2 more, bedrooms, a storage room, and a workshop. The anomaly indicator glowed with the number 7. Ethan looked at the red line and, for the first time, noticed a pale note in small print beneath it. Data collection active. He didn't know what that meant. In his past life, no one ever lived long enough to see such lines. He closed the panel and went to check the post. On the flat roof of a high-rise 2 blocks away stood a figure in a gray cloak. The figure hadn't moved all evening. The sentry said the man had been standing there since the wave hit and was simply staring in their direction. Ethan raised his binoculars. The face beneath the hood was smooth and gray like polished stone. Stone. Instead of eyes, 2 vertical slits glowed dimly. The figure slowly turned its head and looked directly into the lenses of the binoculars through 800 meters of darkness. Then it stepped back and vanished into thin air. Ethan lowered his binoculars. His fingers had turned white against the plastic. Whatever it was, it hadn't come for the cores. Ethan had retrieved the cores from the pumping station and fended off the extortionist Dan Kroger. The first wave had arrived 4 days ahead of schedule. Ethan had sheltered 24 survivors, and his shelter had expanded to level 9 with 3 underground tiers. Barrett Hale, once a mocker, had become the warehouse manager. The anomaly reached 7%, and a message about data collection appeared. A gray observer with slits for eyes was spotted on the roof of a neighboring building. It vanished into thin air. The next 10 days merged into one long hum of activity. Ethan remembered 4 scenes from that time. The first, Barrett stands in the middle of an empty hall on the 2nd level, marking out the layout of the market stalls with chalk on the floor, while behind him, women haul boxes of filtered water. Second, Old Man Moulton, a former water utility engineer, starts up a large filter and the first stream of clean water gushes into a tank while children hold out their palms to catch the spray. Third, late at night, Ethan sits in front of a control panel, running his finger along the lines of the cycle, while the experiment counter spins like the reel of a slot machine. Fourth, morning of the 12th day, a line of strangers stretches from the armored gates all the way down the street. People have come from the far corners of Grey Hall to exchange cores for water and a spot in the sleeping level. Call's shelter had reached the 13th level and now occupied 6 levels underground. The entire East Bank was talking about it. Kroger had sent people over 3 times in recent days. The first time, they offered to buy a steak. The second time, they hinted that fires often broke out in large warehouses. The third time, his men simply stood in front of the gates and counted the visitors. Barrett grew gloomier with each visit. He said that Kroger was gathering all the gangs from the southern end under his control and that it was only a matter of days. Ethan listened and reinforced the perimeter. At level 13, the system unlocked the spiked turrets and the slowdown field in front of the gates for him. Every night, he ran a cycle of countermeasures, and every night the red bar grew. 10%, 13, 16. At 16%, the panel spoke to him directly for the first time. In the middle of the usual experience point calculation, all the lines went dark, and text appeared against a black background. Owner of shelter number 4451. Your operations are violating the balance protocol. Upon reaching 25%, an audit procedure will be initiated. It is recommended that you cease non-standard operations. The text lingered for 10 seconds and faded away. Ethan sat in the darkness, listening to his own heartbeat. Audit. A word from his former line of work. Back then, it meant that someone with authority would come and turn over every stone. He didn't know what it meant here. The answer came 2 days later, along with a girl named Una Rice. She was brought to the gates, half dead, burns on her arms, a gash in her side. She was a scout from the community by the Western Bridge. Once they'd patched her up, she asked to be taken to the shelter's leader and would speak only to him. Una explained that the bridge community hadn't been destroyed by monsters. Their leader, too, had found a flaw in the system. He learned to duplicate blueprints and handed out upgrades to everyone indiscriminately. The community was growing faster than any other in the city, and then one night 3 men in gray arrived. She said they didn't fight. They simply walked through walls as if through smoke, and everything their palms touched crumbled into white sand. Fortifications, weapons, people. They wiped out the level 14 shelter in less time than it takes for the sun to set. They took the leader alive, and he screamed so loudly it could be heard across the river. Una survived because she was on patrol outside. She said that before leaving, one of the men in gray stopped and looked toward the east bank, directly toward Call's shelter. For a long time, as if he were double-checking an address, the room grew very quiet. Barrett was the first to break the silence and asked Ethan what the Greys might have left behind on their side of the river. Ethan held his gaze and told the truth. He told him about the mistake, about the cycle, about the red line that was already showing 19. He expected fear and screams. Barrett was silent for a long time. Then he said that 2 weeks ago he'd considered Ethan a penniless eccentric, but now his stockpiles were feeding 300 people. He said that if the price for this was those gray creatures, then they shouldn't regret it. They should prepare. Moulton nodded. Una, too. She said she wanted to stay and that she knew how the Greys moved. The shelter council met that night until morning. They decided on 3 things. First, do not push the cycle any further unless absolutely necessary, and keep the anomaly below 25. Second, all resources would be devoted to defense and reconnaissance. Third, keep the mistake a secret from outsiders. The Greys were exhausted and began to disperse, and a day later, Kroger struck. He chose his moment wisely. At dawn, as the guard was changing shifts, his gang attacked from 3 sides. 50 fighters, ramming trucks, burning barrels hurled over the wall. Kroger was counting on panic, and on the fact that the trading sanctuary didn't know how to fight. He didn't know about the 13th level. The deceleration field crushed the first wave right at the gates. Kroger's men got stuck in the air like flies in honey, while the towers methodically mowed them down with their spikes. A truck with a battering ram came to a halt in the field as if stuck in concrete. Ethan stood on the wall and watched as the attack faltered. He raised his hand, and the turrets fell silent. He shouted down that the survivors could leave and that the shelter would accept anyone who laid down their weapons. Almost everyone dropped their weapons. Kroger, along with 5 loyal followers, fled south. Barrett stood next to Ethan and looked out at the battlefield. He said quietly that 20 days ago, this basement wouldn't have stopped even a drunken looter. The victory was resounding. Too resounding. By evening, envoys from 4 communities were standing at the gates with gifts and requests for an alliance. And that night, Una woke Ethan. She was standing by the peephole, her face as white as a sheet. On the roof of a high-rise 2 blocks away stood 2 figures in gray. They weren't hiding. One of them raised his hand, and glowing white numbers appeared in the air in front of the shelter, visible from anywhere on the street. 19 7/10%. A line appeared beneath the numbers. 5 3/10 remained until the audit. The men in gray stood there for another minute and then vanished. Ethan stared at the numbers fading away in the air. The system no longer warned him personally. The system displayed the counter to everyone. It was making him a target and calling in the bounty hunters. And then Ethan understood the second half of the trap. Any envious person, any enemy, any frightened neighbor now knew that all it took was to force him to spend a little over 5%, and the Greys would do all the dirty work. In 10 days, the refuge had grown to level 13 and become the commercial hub of the East Coast. The system warned that an audit would begin at 25% anomaly. Scout Una Race reported that the Grey auditors had wiped out the Westbridge community for exploiting a similar glitch. Ethan revealed the truth to the council and gained their support. Kroger's assault was repelled, and his gang was crushed, but he himself escaped. The auditors publicly displayed Ethan's anomaly counter for all to see, 19.7 with a threshold of 25. The morning after the numbers appeared, Ethan locked himself in the lower hall with the control panel and began doing what he did best in both of his lives. He began studying the system as if it were someone else's code. He wrote each operation and its cost in percentages on the wall with chalk. The undo cycle yielded 0.3% per repetition. A standard build yielded nothing. Destroying his own module yielded nothing. He dug deeper. By noon, he found his first lead. When he spent experience on someone else's shelter and upgraded Old Man Moulton's house across the street, the counter dipped. 0.1%. The system treated the transfer of experience as repayment of a debt. Ethan stared at the line, and a plan began to take shape in his mind. The error drew from the common pool. The distribution returned to the pool. He convened a council and announced the program. The shelter would begin upgrading all allied houses in the neighborhood for free. Barrett clutched his head and began calculating the losses. Then he calculated again and slowly broke into a smile. He said that a neighborhood of fortified allies was a wall around their own wall, and that Ethan had just bought the loyalty of 300 people for nothing. For 3 days in a row, Ethan burned through his accumulated experience. The houses along the street were being clad in system stone. The counter was creeping down. 19, 18 and 2, 17 and 6. At 17 and a half, the descent came to a complete halt. The system displayed a blank line. Compensation limit reached. Remaining anomaly fixed. Ethan checked it 3 times using different operations. The wall. There was no way down any further. 17.5% hung over him like a brand, and there were 7.5 left until the audit. Enough to live on if the cycle wasn't touched. Not enough for war if the cycle was needed. And war was knocking at the gates. Una returned from a reconnaissance mission to the southern end and brought back 2 pieces of news. First, Kroger wasn't dead. He'd sworn allegiance to someone in the city center and was gathering people again. Second, a rumor was circulating through the ruins of the city center that the Greys were paying out. To anyone who helped raise the intruder's anomaly, they were giving blueprints of the highest order. The rumor spread through all the markets. The price tag on Ethan's back kept rising. The council decided to prepare for the worst, and the worst didn't take long to arrive. It came 6 days later at sunset, and it didn't come as a crowd. A single man in a gray cloak was walking down an empty street toward the gates, an inspector from the lower circle. Una recognized his gait and began to tremble. Ethan ordered a general alarm. People poured into the lower levels. The towers swiveled into position. The inspector reached the deceleration field and stopped. The field didn't hold him. He stood there as if in ordinary air, scrutinizing the gate. Then he spoke, and his voice sounded as if from everywhere at once. Owner of shelter number 451. Your indicator has been fixed at the threat level. The inspection has been shifted from routine mode to preemptive mode. The sentence is to be carried out immediately. He raised his hand and touched the gate panel. The 13th level armor began to melt into white sand. Ethan watched this from the wall, a chill creeping down his spine. Conventional weapons were useless here. He hadn't counted on conventional methods anyway. The 3 days of preparation weren't spent solely on gaining experience. Ethan had set up along the entrance corridor what Moulton called a ghost meat grinder. The logic was simple. and stemmed from the mistake itself. The Greys erased whatever they touched, so he had to force them to touch something he didn't mind losing, and that would strike back. The inspector stepped into the opening, and the corridor came to life. Sections of the floor collapsed and shot back up as newly reconstructed slabs. Ethan sat deep below in front of a control panel, playing it like an organ. Build, undo, build elsewhere. Each undo returned the material instantly, and the corridor rebuilt itself faster than the inspector could erase it. The labyrinth changed every second. Walls sprang up behind the gray one and jutted out with spikes. The ceiling collapsed and reappeared. The inspector erased and erased, but the corridor regrew like living flesh. The anomaly counter crept upward. 18, 19. Ethan pushed the cycle, and the veins in his temples bulged. 20. For the first time, the inspector lost his rhythm. The erasure was devouring his own reserve, and that reserve was not bottomless. 21. Moulton and his team fired harpoons with coiled green projectiles from the side niches. Ordinary steel melted into the gray mass, but the projectiles burst inside with flashes of pure energy. 22. The inspector fell to one knee in the middle of the corridor, which immediately closed in around him with slabs on all 6 sides. Ethan performed the final cancellation and poured all the experience of the night into the compression in one fell swoop. The slabs came together. There was a sound like a house-sized pane of glass shattering. Silence. When the slabs were pushed apart in the center, it was not a corpse that lay there. There lay a handful of white sand, and within it glowed dimly a deep blue core with a vertical slit inside. A slit exactly like the eyes of the Greys. People howled with joy on every level. Barrett was crying and laughing at the same time. Ethan stood over the blue core and felt no joy. He looked at the panel. 23.8%, just over 1% remained until the audit. And somewhere in the city center, they already knew that the lowest-ranking auditor hadn't returned. Una approached and stood beside him. She said the Greys were circling the lowest ranking, then the middle ranking, then the highest ranking, and that the middle ranking one wouldn't come through the door. Ethan lifted the blue core. It was warm, and something inside it was pulsing slowly. Like a thought, like a memory, the panel flashed and displayed a line he'd never seen before. A carrier of an order core fragment has been detected. Red operation available. Warning. Reading will irreversibly increase the anomaly index by 1%. Ethan stood with the core in his hand, and the math was ruthless. 1% for reading, 24 and 8 in total, 0.2 away from the verdict. Knowledge or a margin of safety. He could choose only one. Ethan discovered that sharing experience with allies reduced the anomaly and fortified the entire neighborhood, but the counter was stuck at 17.5%. The Greys announced a bounty for increasing his anomaly, and Kroger is gathering forces in the center. A lower-ranking auditor attacked the shelter and was destroyed by a living labyrinth based on a cycle of reversals. The anomaly rose to 23 and 8/10 with the threshold at 25. A blue core of order dropped from the auditor. Reading it would provide knowledge, but would raise the anomaly by another percentage point, leaving it 0.2 short of the threshold. Ethan didn't read the core that night, nor the next. The blue fragment lay in a safe on the lower tier, and the refuge lived like a city under siege. 4 scenes from those 2 weeks are etched into his memory. The first, the blacksmith's level, where Moulton and his apprentices work day and night, winding green cores onto harpoons while the wall behind him is hung with finished bundles like ears of grain. The second, the square in front of the gates, where Una drills 100 militiamen from allied houses, and yesterday's bakers are learning to shoot at targets made of gray rags. Third, Barrett at the negotiating table with the leaders of the 8 communities on the eastern shore, his hands tracing a line of common defense on the map from the river to the hills. Fourth, the nighttime dock where boats bring cannonballs from all along the shore, because the shore has realized one simple thing: if call falls, the Greys won't stop. The Eastern Alliance was formed in 14 days, and Ethan became its leader against his will. On the 15th day, intelligence brought the grim news. Kroger has come into power. The Greys have given him top-secret blueprints, and his new fortress in the center is growing like a tumor. He has gathered nearly 1,000 fighters from the dregs of the central ruins and openly proclaims in the markets that he will lead the auditors to the gates of Call and receive his sanctuary as a reward. The middle auditor walks beside him like a banner. The council listened to the report in silence. Everyone understood the situation. The current defenses would not be enough against 1,000 fighters and the middle auditor. They needed trump cards, and one trump card lay in the safe. That evening, Ethan went down to the lower level alone. He sat for a long time in front of the open safe, 0.2% after the scan, thinner than a hair. Then he recalled the sound of the bolt slamming shut in front of him in his past life and took the core into his palm. He confirmed the scan. The world went dark. The knowledge didn't come in words. It fell into him all at once, like icy water down his throat. Ethan saw the system from the inside, and it was no gift from God. It was an old machine operating with a flaw at its very heart. The error involving the return of experience was not his discovery. It was a crack in the machine's core, and the crack grew with each passing year. The auditors were not guardians of justice. They were band-aids, blind tools that didn't repair the crack but erased the witnesses. Everyone who touched the flaw, everyone who saw, and yet another realization sank to the bottom, the coldest one. The machine had already been through this, city after city, world after world. When there were too many witnesses, the auditors didn't mess around. They wiped out the entire node. Ethan saw white sand where the cities had been and realized how his past life had truly ended. It wasn't monsters who burned Greyhall that last month. Someone else had found the crack. Someone else had cranked the counter to the limit and wiped everyone out. He woke up on the floor. Blood was running from his nose. The panel was lit up with a line of text, 24.8%, and below it, a second line that simply couldn't be there. A fragment of the core has been assimilated. Access to the hidden branch of operations has been granted. Target accessible. Greyhall node balance core. Distance 4.2 kilometers. Status damaged. Ethan sat on the cold floor and stared at the word damaged. 4 kilometers downtown, where Kroger is building his fortress, where the machine keeps its rotten heart. And if he could reach it, he wouldn't have to hide from the patches. He could sew up the crack itself or rip out the heart entirely. He stood up and went upstairs to gather the council. He told them everything about the machine, about the patches, about the fate of the nodes where there were too many witnesses, about how their side had already crossed the line because hundreds knew about the error. The reset was only a matter of time, and no wall would stop it. There was only one path left. To reach the core of balance before the machine made its decision, through 1,000 of Kroger's fighters, past the middle auditor, with a 0.2% margin. There was a long silence in the hall. Then Moulton said he'd spent his whole life fixing pipes, and that the city's broken heart was just a very big pipe. Barrett said he'd calculated the odds, and that they were slim, but that a trader always goes where a slim chance yields the whole pot. Una simply stood next to Ethan. The council voted unanimously. For 3 days, the Alliance hammered out a plan. A militia from 8 communities would draw Kroger's forces away with a faint assault from the north. A small detachment would go underground through the old sewers that Moulton knew by heart. Ethan would lead it personally because the covert branch of operations reported only to him. The exit was scheduled for a moonless night. The evening before the mission, Ethan stood on the wall and looked out at the eastern shore, at the lights in the windows of the houses clad in system stone, at the line forming outside the water warehouse, at the children kicking a ball across the square beneath the towers. 26 days ago, there had been a 6x8 basement here and a man with 3 gray cores in his pocket. He thought he'd found a loophole to power, but what he found was a crack through which he could see how the world was put together. Una climbed onto the wall and said that the squad was assembled and the collector had been opened. Ethan nodded, and at that moment, the sky above the city center flashed silently. A white pillar of light rose above Kroger's fortress and pierced the clouds. The panel before Ethan's eyes exploded with lines of text. Attention, all Grey Hall node owners. Tampering with the balance core has been detected. The node has been placed in quarantine mode. A senior auditor has been dispatched to stabilize the situation. Ethan stared at the pillar of light, and inside him, everything contracted into an icy lump. Someone had reached the heart of the machine before he did. Kroger, with his stolen blueprints, had ventured where one should never go without authorization. And now it wasn't a regular auditor heading toward the city, it was a senior auditor. And that meant the countdown wasn't measured in days, but by the hour. Ethan turned to Una and said the plan was changing. We're not leaving on a moonless night. We're leaving now. The East Coast had united under Ethan's leadership, while Kroger had received the top-secret blueprints from the Greys and assembled 1,000 fighters with the support of a mid-level auditor. Ethan scanned the blue core, raising the anomaly to 24 8/10. He learned that the system was a damaged machine and that the auditors were erasing witnesses to the crack. When there were too many witnesses, they wiped out entire cities. A target, the balance core, has been identified in the center of Grey Hall, 4 kilometers away. The council decided to reach the core via the collectors. As they were preparing, Kroger himself intervened in the balance core. The city has been placed under quarantine, and a senior auditor has been dispatched there. Ethan's squad is departing immediately. The collector greeted the squad with the smell of rusty water and a hollow darkness. Moulton led the way with a lantern, guiding them through the pipes he himself had laid 30 years ago. Behind him moved Ethan and Una, along with 8 of the militia's best fighters, armed with harpoons and bundles of green cores. Above, through the grates of the storm drains, white light seeped through the storm drain grates from the pole above the center. The light did not flicker. It stood like a dead column, and its unchanging nature was more unsettling than any howl. For the first hour, they walked in silence. As they moved, Ethan studied the hidden branch of operations that the blue projectile had revealed. The panel showed him what no living person had ever seen, thin, glowing veins running along the walls of the collector. Moulton knew these tunnels as pipes. Ethan now saw them as vessels. The city's entire underground network turned out to be the machine's circulatory system, and the veins converged toward the center like spokes toward a hub. One could follow the veins like a guiding thread, and anything could come to them through those veins. 2 hours into their journey, the veins on the walls quivered. The light within them flowed backward. Ethan raised his fist, and the squad froze. A sound came from a side passage ahead. Not footsteps. A rustle, dry and fluid, like shifting sand. Una said with just her lips that this was how the remains of the bridge community sounded when the wind drove white sand across the ruins. A stream flowed out of the side passage into the main tunnel. The white sand moved against all laws of its own accord, and shapes could be discerned within its mass. Hands, faces! Everything the inspectors had erased in this city had not vanished. It flowed through the machine's veins like slag. The sand sensed the living and rose in a wave. Figures coalesced from the wave. Dozens of faceless human silhouettes with hollows where their eyes should be. They advanced on the squad in silence, and at that silence, the harpoons trembled in the fighters' hands. Ethan ordered a retreat into a narrow channel where the sand could not spread out across a wide front. Green projectiles tore the silhouettes to shreds, but the shreds flowed back into the stream and reformed. Moulton shouted that 50 meters ahead was an airlock chamber with a slide gate. The squad retreated, firing back in bursts. The sand pressed in. One of the fighters stumbled, and a white hand grabbed him by the ankle. His leg below the knee crumbled into sand before he could even scream. His comrades dragged him into the chamber, and Moulton and Una threw themselves against the gate's control wheel. The steel plate crept downward unbearably slowly. Ethan stepped into the opening and did the only thing that could buy them a few seconds. He opened the panel and began building. A hidden branch allowed him to place system plates directly into the machine's circuits. He erected wall after wall across the tunnel, and the sand devoured them one by one while the anomaly counter crept along, 24 and 9. The gate slid into place. Ethan canceled the last unfinished wall and returned the material. The counter froze. 24 and 9/10, 1/10 away from the verdict. 11 people were breathing heavily in the chamber. The wounded man's stump had been tied off with a tourniquet. He wasn't moaning. He was staring at the clean cut of his leg and repeating that there wasn't even any blood, just no leg. Moulton led Ethan to the diagram on the cell wall, his finger trembling. He said that sand had blocked the main passage and that there was only one route left to the center, through the old spillway, under the river. He said that this tunnel ran right beneath the riverbed and that it had been sealed off before he was even born because of cracks in the vault. There was no choice. The squad moved toward the spillway and the wounded man was carried on tied-together harpoons. The tunnel under the river turned out to be worse than the stories had suggested. Water was seeping from the vault. Along the walls, the machine's veins glowed dimly and erratically, like diseased veins. Moulton said that even the machine didn't like this place. They waded knee-deep in black water, following one another's footsteps. Halfway through, Ethan saw a light ahead. It wasn't a lifeless white light. It was the yellow living light of a campfire. In a widening of the tunnel, on a concrete island, people were sitting. 12 ragged figures gathered around the fire. They sprang to their feet and brandished homemade spears. A woman with a strand of gray running through her hair stepped forward and asked who was walking beneath the river on a quarantine night. Una replied that they were coming from the East Bank. The woman lowered her spear and laughed a terrifying laugh. She said that the East Bank was a fairy tale for the dying, that there was no such thing as a bank where the water was clean and the walls didn't crumble. She said they were fugitives from Kroger's central basements, the laborers who had dug his fortress, and whom he had written off as expendable once the fortress was complete. Ethan stepped into the light and gave his name. The woman stared at him for a long time. Then, she said she had heard that name from the overseers. Kroger called him his personal enemy and promised to feed him to the inspectors. She asked why the master of the well-fed shore was venturing down to the river into the very heart of the inferno. Ethan replied that he was going to stop what had broken out in the center, and that after that there would be enough room in the east for everyone under this vault. The woman named Sarta exchanged glances with her companions. She said that until yesterday, she had been digging a bypass channel right beneath the fortress and knew of approaches that weren't marked on any map. She said she would help guide them through, not for a spot on the bank, but to see with her own eyes the Kruger house crumble. The squad had grown to 26 people. Right at the exit from beneath the river, the veins on the walls suddenly flared up all at once and went out. A jolt rippled through the tunnel. Crumbs rained down from the vault. Then a second jolt, stronger. Sarda whispered that this was how the core had been breathing since last night. Ethan opened the panel and the readings on it were fluctuating wildly. Balance core integrity is dropping. 71% estimated time to critical threshold, 40 hours. Upon reaching the threshold, the node will be reset to 0. He looked up. Ahead, the tunnel ascended, and a pillar of white light streamed through a breach in the vault. They had reached the very edge of the center's dead zone, 40 hours. Ethan ordered a 1-hour rest, not a minute more. The men made it to a dry ledge. Una sat down next to Ethan and asked quietly what would happen if they didn't make it in time. Ethan looked at the sleeping men, at the wounded man's stump, at the gray strand of Sart's hair. He replied that they would make it. He had no other answer. The squad passed through the drainage tunnels and was attacked by living white sand, people erased by the inspectors, losing one fighter's leg in the process. Ethan's anomaly had reached 24.9% with the threshold at 25. The path lay through an old spillway beneath the river, where the squad encountered Kroger's fugitive slaves, led by Sarda, who knows the secret approaches to the fortress. The balance core is collapsing, and there are 40 hours left until the city is wiped out. The squad stands at the edge of the center's dead zone. The dead zone began immediately beyond the breach. The squad emerged from underground, a block away from Kroger's fortress, and Ethan saw the center with his own eyes for the first time. The streets stood untouched and were all the more eerie for it. No corpses, no craters. The buildings were intact down to the last pane of glass, but everything was bathed in the even white light of the pillar, and there wasn't a single shadow in that light. Sarda said the shadows had disappeared yesterday when the pillar rose. She said Kroger's men had laughed at it at first, but by morning, half the garrison had fled the city center, scattering in all directions. The fortress rose ahead in terraces of black system stone. Kroger had built it around the old city hall, and according to the panel's data, the balance core lay beneath the city hall at a depth of 30 meters. Between the squad and the town hall stood a 15-meter-thick outer wall, and all that remained of 1,000 soldiers. Sarta led them along a bypass channel. The channel led to the underbelly of the fortress, to a drainage grate that Sarta herself had installed a month ago with a clever fastening in case of an escape. The grate swung open without a sound. The squad made their way into the fortress's lower galleries, and there it became clear why the garrison had fled. No one came out to meet them in the galleries. Abandoned weapons lay at the guard posts. In the barracks level stood untouched cauldrons of congealed porridge, and fresh furrows stretched along the walls everywhere, as if someone had run a finger across the stone, and the stone beneath the finger had turned into white sand. The sand lay in trails along the furrows. Una walked and counted aloud in a whisper. She counted 40 grooves and lost count. The chief inspector had walked through these galleries, and he hadn't fought the garrison. He had been gathering them together. The first survivor was found on the stairs of the second level. One of Kroger's men was sitting on the steps, hugging his knees and rocking back and forth. He didn't even look at the squad. He kept repeating the same thing: that the master had opened the door leading down, and light had come out of the door, and now the master speaks with the voice of light. Sarda crouched down in front of him and asked where Kroger was now. The fighter raised his vacant eyes and said that the master was in the throne room, that the master was now always in the throne room, and that the master was eagerly awaiting guests from the east. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. They were expected. There was no longer any point in secrecy, and time was running out. 40 hours had turned into 36. Ethan led the squad straight to City Hall through the main courtyard. The courtyard turned out to be full of people. 200 of Kroger's fighters stood in even rows facing City Hall, not moving a muscle. The squad marched past their frozen backs, and not a single one of the 200 turned their heads. Up close, it became clear that they were all breathing, that their eyes were all open, and that their pupils had all narrowed into vertical slits. Moulton whispered that they were no longer people, but gloves. The town hall doors stood wide open. The throne room spanned the entire height of the building, and in the middle of the floor, a round hole gaped downward toward the core. From the hole, that very same white pillar shot up, piercing right through the roof, and at the edge of the hole stood Kroger. Ethan barely recognized him. His body had melted and was oozing like wax. Half of his face remained human, and that half was smiling the old brazen smile of the auto repair shop owner. The other half had become a smooth gray stone with a vertical slit for an eye. Kroger spread his arms and spoke in two voices at once. The human voice said he was glad to see his neighbor call and that he should have agreed to 5 cores a week. The second voice, even and genderless, spoke over the first, stating that the carrier of the core fragment had arrived at the designated point, and that integration could be completed. Ethan asked what he had done to himself. Kroger's human half laughed heartily and recounted the story as eagerly as one would describe the best deal of their life. The Greys had given him blueprints, and he had built it. Then the Greys had offered him something more. The middle auditor said that the machine was aging and that the patches needed local roots, that the machine was ready to take a human as a partner, to merge him with the node's core and give him the city forever. Kroger agreed without a second thought. And then it turned out that the partnership worked both ways, that the core was damaged, and that now the crack in the core ran right through him. He said all this while still smiling, though only the eye on the human half of his face twitched with horror that no smile could hide. A second voice cut him off and addressed Ethan directly. It said that the core's integrity was deteriorating due to a conflict between the hosts, that there could not be two fragment holders in the node. Ethan was offered the chance to surrender the fragment voluntarily and receive the status of overseer of the eastern sector. In case of refusal, the fragment would be extracted along with the host. While the voice spoke, Ethan wasn't looking at Kroger. He was looking at the breach and at the panel. A hidden branch unfolded a diagram of the core before him, and the diagram screamed. The crack ran through the entire core, and a foreign body had been driven into the crack like a wedge, Kroger's consciousness. The machine wasn't healing the core. The machine had plugged the crack with a living person, and the person inside the crack wasn't holding it shut. He was widening it. Every one of his fears, every greedy thought, all of it was tearing the core further apart. The reset had become a matter of time, not because of the witnesses, but because of the patch itself. Ethan realized something else too. Pulling Kroger out of the crack meant bringing down the core immediately. Leaving him there meant bringing it down in 30 hours. The machine suggested he become the second wedge next to the first, to bury himself in the fissure so the city could hold out a little longer. He took a step forward and said he wanted to look at the core up close before deciding. The second voice paused and gave its permission. The eye slits of 200 fighters in the courtyard blinked in unison. The squad remained at the door under their gaze while Ethan approached the edge of the chasm. 30 meters below, a sphere of fractured light spun and the crack within it pulsed black. Ethan opened the panel. He had no intention of becoming a wedge. For 12 years of his past life, he'd been fixing other people's code, and he knew the ironclad rule, patch upon patch, kills the system. The rotten section must be cut out entirely and rewritten from scratch. The hidden branch showed him the kernel's structure as source code. And in the source code, he saw what the blind machine itself could not see. The kernel didn't need to be saved. The kernel could be rebuilt. The operation was called Reconstruction in the thread, and it required a monstrous effort. All the expertise from every level of his refuge, everything accumulated over 26 days, and a conduit inside the kernel that would hold the structure together during the rebuild. A living conduit. Ethan stood over the chasm, and the numbers added up in only one way. A second voice asked if he had made a decision. Ethan replied that he had, and he started the cycle. The squad entered the fortress through Sarta's secret passage and found the garrison transformed into puppets with vertical pupils. Kroger had fused with the damaged balance core, becoming a living patch in the crack, and was now destroying the core from within. The machine offered Ethan the chance to voluntarily become the second wedge in the crack. Ethan discovered, in a hidden branch, a core reconstruction operation that required all the experience of his refuge and a living conductor inside the core. About 30 hours until reset. Ethan announced that he had made his decision and began the cycle at the edge of the collapse. The first 3 rollbacks occurred before the machine realized what was happening. Ethan was placing system plates directly into the veins around the breach, tearing down the structure and feeding the data into the reconstruction drive, while the anomaly counter jumped past the threshold. 25, exactly. 25 and 3. The panel flooded with red. The verdict is in. The carrier is subject to immediate confiscation. The second voice inside Kroger's body broke into the machine's screech, and the courtyard outside came to life. 200 puppets turned toward the town hall doors in unison. Una shouted to set up a defense, and the squad formed a wall of shields made from torn-off door panels in the doorway. Ethan couldn't help them. Every second of the cycle was flooding the storage device, and to look away would mean losing everything. He pushed the operations forward and heard behind him the harpoons tearing through the front ranks of the puppets and Molten roaring to hold the doorway, and then a third sound cut through the screech of the machine. Steady footsteps on stone. The middle inspector was walking across the courtyard through the ranks of his own puppets. He was 2 heads taller than the lowest-ranking one, and the light from the lamppost passed through his cloak as if through smoke. The puppets parted before him in a wave. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and realized that his shields wouldn't hold him back for even a breath. And then, from the shadows of the side gallery, Sarda emerged toward the inspector with her fugitives. They made no attempt to fight. They carried out what they had been silently preparing ever since entering the fortress, moving through the galleries. They brought down the sawed-through fasteners of the gallery's ceiling beams, and 40 metric tons of black stone fell between the inspector and the town hall doors. Sarta shouted through the dust that Kroger's slaves had been digging beneath this courtyard for 3 weeks and knew exactly where everything was held in place. The rubble couldn't kill the inspector. The rubble bought them a few minutes. The inspector began to chip away at the stone, and the stone crumbled like sand, but there was a lot of it. Ethan squeezed every last minute out of them. The storage unit had crawled halfway through, and then the machine changed tactics. Kroger, standing by the hole, suddenly arched his back, and his human half screamed in pain. The machine delved into his memory and now struck with precision. White sand flowed through the veins in the town hall's walls, and the sand coalesced, not into faceless figures. It coalesced into people the squad knew. Before Molten, his late wife rose from the sand. Before Una, the scouts from her vanished community appeared. Before the fighters, their neighbors, erased by the wave, appeared. The figures did not attack. They reached out their hands and called out names in voices from Kroger's memory. He who had spent a month gathering rumors about everyone on the eastern shore. The ranks wavered. One fighter lowered his harpoon and stepped toward the sandy figure of his son. Una managed to knock him off his feet a split second before he touched it. She rose above him and shouted across the hall that the dead do not return, and that the sand is a graveyard, not a reunion, that her entire community was there and she would strike anyway. The ranks straightened. Molten stared at his sandy wife for a long second. Then he said, "I'm sorry," quietly to her, and shattered the figure with a harpoon. The storage drive was 3/4 full. The rubble in the courtyard was melting away. The inspector was already visible waist-deep in the gap. Ethan's anomaly was spinning like a mad wheel, 30%, 35. The panel was no longer a threat. The panel glowed solid red. And at 80% of the storage capacity, what Ethan feared more than the auditor happened. The experiment was over. The cycle had drained the surrounding veins dry, and new resets yielded only crumbs. It was exactly 1/5 short of a full drive. Ethan stood on the brink of failure, and inside he felt empty and hollow. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. And then the final plan took shape in his mind. The experience wasn't just in his veins. The experience was in his sanctuary. 13 levels. 6 tiers. Everything he'd fought for over 26 days. A hidden branch allowed the owner to dismantle his own shelter remotely and retrieve all the invested experience with a single transfer. 300 people were sleeping there now, protected by the best walls on the East Coast, and those walls had to disappear. Ethan called Barrett via the communication core. Barrett's voice, crackling over the line, asked how things were going at the center. Ethan told him exactly what was happening. That everyone had to be evacuated from the shelter to the square within 10 minutes, that the walls were about to vanish, that if he didn't do this, the entire city would vanish in 30 hours. The communication core was silent for a long time. Then, Barrett said that 26 days ago, he'd considered Ethan a penniless eccentric and had since sworn off arguing with him. He said, to start the evacuation. For 10 minutes, Ethan held the opening open along with everyone else. He tore the puppets with a harpoon and counted the seconds. The inspector had cleared half the barricade. The communication core flashed. Barrett's voice said the square was full. And the shelter was empty. He added quietly that it had been beautiful while it lasted. Ethan confirmed the assessment. 4 kilometers away, on the eastern shore, 6 underground tiers merged into light, and light surged through the city's veins toward the center. The storage unit flashed at full capacity. Reconstruction is available. A guide is required. Ethan looked down at the cracked sphere. The guide had to enter the core and hold the structure together while the reassembly took place. The branch honestly displayed the guide's probability of survival. It read, "Unknown." Ethan stepped toward the edge and was held back by a hand. Moulton stood beside him, covered in sand and blood. The old man said that the conduit needed to hold the structure together, not understand it, that Ethan was the only one who knew how to read this machine, and that the reader was needed outside at the control panel, and the old water utility engineer had known how to handle the pressure his whole life. Ethan started to say no, but Moulton didn't listen. He said his wife was already down there in the sand and that it wasn't right for a wife to wait so long, and he stepped over the edge. Ethan began accumulating experience to reconstruct the core, and his anomaly breached the threshold, triggering the verdict. The squad held the town hall against 200 puppets, while the fugitive Sarts used a barricade to detain the middle auditor. The machine attacked with sandy copies of deceased loved ones. But the formation held. There wasn't enough experience, so Ethan remotely dismantled his level 13 shelter, evacuating 300 people through Barrett. The storage unit is full. For reconstruction, a living conduit is needed inside the core with unknown chances of survival. Moulton jumped into the void in Ethan's place. Moulton fell into the light, and the light accepted him before he reached the sphere. The panel in front of Ethan exploded into lines of code. Conduit accepted, structure captured, reconstruction initiated, control window open, and the whole world stood still. The pillar of light went out. The puppets in the courtyard slumped onto the stones like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The middle auditor froze in the gap in the rubble with his arm outstretched. Dust hung in the air, not quite reaching the floor. Only Ethan and the panel in front of him were moving. The control window expanded to fill the entire hall. The core lay before him, laid bare like source code on a screen from a past life. Millions of lines of rules by which the machine had governed this world ever since the fog's arrival. Ethan read, and the hairs on the back of his neck bristled. He saw the rule by which the fog had unleashed the monsters. He saw the rule by which cores fell from the creatures. He saw the rule by which the system granted shelters and levels. The machine did not protect people from the apocalypse. The machine was the apocalypse. An ancient mechanism of selection that sowed worlds with threats and watched to see how each one grew. The inspectors pruned those who grew the wrong way, and the crack through which Ethan had made his entire journey was simply the machine's old age, the wear and tear of the metal. He could rewrite anything now. Erase the monsters, shut down the inspectors, grant everyone limitless levels. His fingers hovered over the lines, and Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly. 12 years of craft spoke to him in a cold voice. A major edit to a live system kills the system. The world had already restructured itself around the machine. The cores had become the lifeblood of the economy. The shelters had become cities. Removing everything in one fell swoop would mean bringing down the new world just as he had brought down his own shelter an hour ago. Only no one would have time to escape from within these walls. He started with the small but crucial details. He found the auditor's branch and rewrote their objective. Do not erase witnesses to the cracks, repair the cracks, and protect the nodes. He found the rule governing punishment for anomalies and erased it entirely. He found the anomaly counters for all the node's inhabitants and reset each one to 0. He checked his own last. 41% was glowing red, then went dark. Then he opened the core's status line and saw molten. The conduit held the structure, and the structure held the conduit. The old man was woven into the core by 1,000 threads, and the panel displayed his steady, stubborn pulse. Extracting the conduit before the rebuild is complete is impossible. After the rebuild, the probability of extraction is 30%. Ethan stared at the number and knew he would haggle with the machine over those percentages until the very end. He hammered a new rule into the core using his authority as the fragment holder. The conduit's life takes priority over reconstruction. The machine swallowed the rule in silence. One last branch remained, and the hardest one, Kroger. The living wedge was still jutting out of the old crack, and the reassembly proceeded around it like water around a pile. Ethan opened its structure. Kroger's consciousness was split between his body near the breach and the core, and both halves were howling in pain that Ethan could now see directly in the code. The machine used his fear as cement. He was suffering, and that suffering held the old crack in place while the new structure was being built. He could have left everything as it was until the rebuild was complete. That would have been safer for the city. Ethan found the disconnection command. Removing the wedge now would reduce the rebuild's stability by 9% and would simply mean death for Kroger. An ordinary human death instead of the eternity of cement. Ethan remembered the gun at his gate, the extortion, and the dawn assault. Then he remembered the eye on the human half of the face, twitching with terror. He confirmed the disconnection. The stability dipped and then stabilized. At the breach in the frozen world, Kroger's body slowly sank to the floor, and his half-stoned face became entirely human with his final breath. The control window flashed yellow. Window resource is running out. The reassembly is entering the autonomous phase. The holder is advised to leave the circuit. Ethan performed the final operation. He embedded the right to self-governance into the new core, a council of living human holders from the city instead of blind protocols. And he stepped out of the window. The world sighed and moved on. Dust settled onto the floor. The chief auditor in the breach blinked through his slits and slowly lowered his outstretched hand. He turned his head toward Ethan, and Ethan tensed his entire body. The auditor crossed the hall with steady steps, stopped 3 meters away, and did something that made Una's jaw drop. He bowed. A steady, genderless voice announced that the Grey Hall node had been placed under protection, that the audit had been canceled, that the fragment's holder was granted the status of node custodian. The puppets in the courtyard rose from the stones, and the vertical slits in their eyes melted away. 200 people looked around, not understanding where they were or why everything hurt. The squad's fighters stood among them, their harpoons lowered, unable to believe the silence. Sarda approached Kroger's body and stared for a long time at the dead man's face. Then she said that she had imagined this moment every night for a month, and that in her dreams it had been sweeter. No longer did a pillar pulse from the void. A steady golden glow rose from the void, and deep within it, a solid sphere spun without a single crack. The reassembly was underway, and the panel displayed 19 hours until completion. And at the very bottom of the panel was the line that had kept Ethan from leaving the void. Conductor stable. Ethan sat down on the edge and remained seated. Una sat down beside him. She asked what he'd been doing there in frozen time for so long. Ethan thought for a moment and replied that he'd been repairing a very old pipe. Una snorted and said that Moulton would appreciate it when he came out. She emphasized the word when with her voice, and Ethan was grateful to her for that. By evening, people began to enter the dead zone. First came the Eastern Union scouts who'd lost contact with their unit. Then came the residents of the nearby basements, who'd been staring at the pillar for 3 days, waiting for the end. They walked toward City Hall in the golden light, and Ethan watched from the steps as the courtyard filled up. Barrett arrived around midnight, having driven the horses hard. He ran up the steps, hugged Ethan, and immediately asked in a businesslike tone who was in charge of Kroger's central warehouses, because if no one was, it was a real shame. Ethan laughed for the first time in 3 days, and on the dashboard, amid the neat rows of rebuild logs, there was a single new message marked pending. The sender was listed as the Node Network. Ethan opened it after everyone had fallen asleep. The message was short. The Grey Hall node has changed its protocol. The change has been detected by neighboring nodes. Expect contact. Ethan reread it 3 times. He had healed his city, and just now the rest of the machine world had learned that someone in Grey Hall knew how to rewrite it. Within the frozen timeline, Ethan rewrote the core. The auditors became the node's defenders. The sentences and anomaly counters were erased, and the city was granted self-governance. Molten is woven into the core as a conductor, and his extraction is possible after a rebuild with a probability for which Ethan entered a priority rule. Kroger was separated from the rift and died as a human. The chief auditor bowed to Ethan and recognized him as the node's overseer. The reassembly will be complete in 19 hours. A message arrived from the node network. Neighboring nodes detected a protocol change and instructed us to await contact. Contact came before the reassembly was complete. At dawn, the sentries on the fortress's outer wall sounded the alarm, and Ethan ran upstairs, his heart pounding. A procession was moving down the main avenue from the northern outskirts toward the center. Leading the way were 6 figures in gray, and at first glance Una could tell by their gait that all 6 were older than average. Behind them floated a white stone platform without wheels or supports. On the platform stood a chair, and a man sat in the chair. The procession stopped 100 paces from the gate. The man rose from the chair and walked toward the gate alone, while the men in gray remained standing. Ethan came downstairs and went out to meet him, also alone, despite Una's protests. Up close, the guest turned out to be a man of about 60 in simple traveling clothes. His face was weather-beaten and weary. His eyes were ordinary human eyes, yet very attentive. He stopped 3 steps away, bowed in the old-fashioned way, and introduced himself. Miaba Azimkero, the supervisor of the Valgran node, a city 400 kilometers to the north. He said he'd been on the road for 2 days since his panel indicated a protocol change in Grey Hall. Ethan asked why the supervisor of a foreign node had an entourage of senior auditors. Azim smiled slightly and replied that 22 years ago in Valgran, a communications engineer had also found a crack in the machine. Ethan looked at him, and a chill ran down his spine. He wasn't the first. Azim spoke slowly as they walked across the courtyard toward City Hall, and every word weighed heavily. There are more than 40 nodes on the continent. There are 7 human caretakers. Each had once reached their core in their own way, and each had paid their price. A quiet alliance has held among the 7 nodes for 20 years now. They cover for one another, make adjustments, mask the anomalies of the growing loners, and slowly, very slowly, buy the world back from the machine. Ethan asked why so slowly. Why don't the 7 keepers with access to the cores rewrite everything at once? Azim stopped at the chasm with its golden glow and stared down into it for a long time. Then he replied that he, too, had asked his predecessor the same question, that the machine isn't alone, that the continent's nodes are branches, and the root lies somewhere across the ocean in a place the panels call the source node, and that the root detects major changes. 30 years ago, 3 guardians on the southern continent decided they were powerful enough and overrode the protocols all at once on all their nodes. Azim said that the southern continent no longer appeared on the map. There was a blank spot, and the panels described it with a single word: formatting. The town hall fell completely silent. Barrett was the first to speak up and asked why Azim had traveled for 2 days then, to warn them to keep quiet. Azim shook his head. He said he'd come because Grey Hall had done what none of the other 7 had done. They'd all made only cosmetic changes to the protocols. They'd watered them down, they'd sidestepped them, but Ethan had completely rebuilt the core from scratch, and the root had accepted it. The panels of all 7 nodes showed the rebuild as routine maintenance. Azim said that either the root's machine was aging faster than they'd thought, or Ethan's reconstruction had followed some ancient rules that the root respects, and that in either case, for the first time in 20 years, the Union had a person who knew how to fix the machine rather than deceive it. He looked Ethan in the eye and told him why he'd really come. The source node is waking up. For the past 3 years, across all continents, the panels have been picking up fragments of a single protocol that is slowly spreading out from the ocean. The protocol is referred to in the lines as the harvest, None of the 7 know what it is, but the nodes through which the fragments have passed have begun to change the rules. The fog is thickening there. The creatures are growing. Cores are becoming more expensive. Somewhere far away, a machine has begun to tweak the selection process, and the 7 overseers, with their cosmetic adjustments, are powerless against it. Azim said that the Union needs an 8th member, one who can read the source code, and that the path to the source node begins with the 8th member getting their node up and running and teaching others what they've done here. The room fell silent. Ethan walked over to the shaft. Below, a golden sphere spun steadily, and the line at the bottom of the panel showed 1 hour remaining until the rebuild was complete. He thought about the 300 people in the square by the dismantled shelter, about the eastern shore that needed to be rebuilt, about the white spot where the continent used to be, about the word harvest. 27 days ago, all he wanted was to survive the first wave. The panel flashed, rebuilding complete. The Grey Hall node is operating under the new protocol. The guide extraction operation is available. Ethan forgot about Azim, about the Alliance, about everything. He launched the operation. The probability of extraction stood at 31%, and hanging below it was his own rule. The guide's life is the priority. The machine asked for confirmation. Ethan confirmed and clung to the edge of the void. The golden glow below grew denser. The sphere slowed. A figure began to take shape from the light, rising upward unbearably slowly. The panel spewed out lines of text. Thread separation, 40%, 70, 90, failure. Ethan held his breath. Compensation, per priority rule, node resources redirected. Separation complete. The figure shot out of the rift and rolled across the hall's floor. Molten lay on the stones, naked as a newborn, coughing. His hair had turned white down to the very last strand, and thin golden lines glowed all over his body like cracks in an old cup that had been glued back together. He blinked, saw the people leaning over him, and the first thing he asked in a hoarse voice was whether the pipe was working or not. Una laughed and cried at the same time. Barrett pulled off his cloak and wrapped it around the old man. Azim stared at the golden lines on Molten's skin, his face filled with shock. He said quietly that in 22 years he had never seen a projectile return its guide. That evening, a council unlike any this city had ever seen gathered on the steps of City Hall. The 8 communities of the East, the elders of the liberated garrison, the fugitive Sarts, Valgrana's steward with his gray retinue. Ethan stood before them and spoke plainly. Grey Hall has stood its ground, and Grey Hall no longer fears its own walls. The refuge to the east will be rebuilt within a month, and it will become a school for anyone who wants to understand the machine, not just feed it cores. And then he spoke of the north, of the Union of 7, and of what is spreading out from the ocean. He said he would travel to Valgran once the city was back on its feet, and that this journey, by all accounts, would be a long one. That night, Ethan opened the panel for the last time that day. The new status glowed steadily. Grey Hall Node Keeper, Anomaly 0, and at the very bottom, where a red thread had hung a month ago, there was now another line that smelled of a long road ahead. Synchronization with the node network established. Continental map available. 43 nodes. 7 green, 35 yellow, and 1 across the ocean, glowing a steady, deep red. Ethan stared at the red dot, and the red dot seemed to be staring back at him. He closed the panel and went to sleep. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, he fell asleep in a city where he wasn't afraid. Azim Caro, the caretaker of the Valgran node, arrived in Grey Hall and revealed the existence of the union of the 7 human caretakers. The machine's root lies in the source node across the ocean. It wiped out the southern continent for making rough edits and is now spreading the harvest protocol. The Alliance calls upon Ethan as the 8th member, the only one capable of reassembling cores. The reassembly was completed, and Molten was extracted alive from the core, his body marked with golden tags. The city has rallied around City Hall. It has been decided to rebuild the shelter as a school. Ethan has assumed the status of Grey Hall's overseer with a 0 anomaly and received a map of the continent's 43 nodes, with the red source node across the ocean. A trip to Valgran is scheduled for after the city's restoration. The month of Grey Hole's reconstruction was etched into Ethan's memory in 4 snapshots. First, the excavation pit at the site of the old shelter, where 300 people and 200 of Kroger's former puppets are working together to lay the foundation for the new complex, while Barrett rushes around the edge of the pit with blueprints and a hoarse voice. Second, the first lesson in an unfinished school hall, where Ethan draws the panels mechanism with chalk on a blackboard, and 40 students ranging from teenagers to gray-haired elders sit before him, their eyes ablaze. Third, Molten, with golden lines on his skin, stands above the city's new core. The lines on his arms glow in time with the sphere's pulse, and he says that he hears the machine like an old familiar pipe. Scene 4. The morning of departure. A convoy of 20 wagons at the northern gate. A crowd fills the entire square, and Sarta, with a strand of gray hair, accepts the seal of the city's governor from Ethan's hands. This time there were 2 skeptics, and both surprised him. The first was Grives, the elder of the fishing community, who had spent the entire month grumbling at every council meeting that the school was a whim and that the machine couldn't be understood, only fed. On the day of departure, Grives came to the convoy, led his grandson by the shoulder, and asked that the boy be taken on as an apprentice. He said that yesterday, his grandson had fixed a malfunctioning panel on a neighbor's shelter in an hour right in front of him, and that an old fool knows how to admit when he's wrong. The second skeptic turned out to be Azim himself. Valgrana's overseer had been observing the school for a month with polite skepticism and said that knowledge of the cores had been kept secret for 20 years, not out of greed, but out of fear. That a crowd of trained people is a crowd of future violators. During the last week, he sat through 3 lessons in a row without saying a word. After the third one, he approached Ethan and said that in 20 years, the secret hadn't saved the southern continent, but 1 month at this school had given Greyhall 20 people capable of holding the node if the warden were to die. He said he'd been wrong all 20 years, and that he'd ask Ethan to open a similar school in Valgran. The journey north took 9 days, and the road itself told more about the world than any information panel ever could. For the first 3 days, the caravan traveled through lands that Greyhall had managed to defend, and here, along the roadside, stood living villages with fortified palisades. Further on, the wastelands of the Middle Belt began, burnt-out towns, shell-like shelters with collapsed vaults. On the 6th day, at a ford across the Black River, the caravan encountered an outpost of a foreign node, and Ethan saw for the first time how people lived under a different overseer. The people at the outpost were well-fed and armed, and they looked like wolves. Azim paid the toll in green cores, and that evening, by the campfire, he explained that the carrot node was one of the yellow ones, that no one there had reassembled the core, and it was slowly rotting away, and the node had no overseer. There was a triumvirate of clans that milked the protocols like a cow and slaughtered anyone who reached for knowledge. Ethan asked why the Union of Seven tolerated this. Azim replied harshly that for 20 years, the Union had done nothing but tolerate it because the alternative was the white spot. He added quietly that with the arrival of the 8th, the arithmetic might change. Valgran came into view on the 9th day from the pass, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The city stood in the bowl of a valley, and above it a dome of pale golden light, and beneath the dome lay terraced gardens, white houses, and windmills. 22 years of steady, careful adjustments had transformed the node into a place where the apocalypse seemed like an old fairy tale. The entire city turned out to greet the caravan, and 2 days later, the Council of Seven gathered in the circular hall beneath the dome. The overseers had been arriving for a week. The sullen giantess Olda, from the mountain node of Tarn. The Way twins from the 2 lake nodes, who spoke in turn, finishing each other's sentences. Moses, an old man as thin as a rake, from the coastal node of Galt. Young Iris from the forest node of Shenor, who had inherited the core from her deceased mother, and Azim, 7 people who held the continent on their shoulders. Ethan entered as the 8th and spent 3 days telling and demonstrating the rebuild, the hidden branch, The Rule of Life's Priority, records from the Grey Hall core. The council listened, and Ethan saw how their faces changed over the course of 3 days. The hope on those faces looked almost like fear. On the 4th day, they moved on to the main point, and Moses laid it out. His coastal node was the closest to the ocean, and its panels were the first to pick up fragments of the harvest protocol. Over the course of 3 years, he pieced together a picture from the fragments, and this was what it looked like. The source node across the ocean was keeping track. Every node in the world was accumulating an aggregate metric in its core, what the panels called yield. Shelter levels, core density, number of survivors. All of this converged into a single figure. And when a node's figure reached the threshold, the harvest protocol mandated the harvest. The fragments did not specify what the harvest entailed, but Moses overlaid the machine's archives, which Ethan had uncovered in Grey Hall's core, onto the map, and the match was chilling. The machine's worlds lived in cycles: fog, selection, growth, and after 40 to 50 years, silence in the archives. The machine grew the harvest and reaped it. According to Moses' calculations, the continent's richest nodes had 6 to 7 years left before reaching the threshold, and after the reconfiguration, Grey Hall became the continent's richest node. Ethan listened, and a familiar cold clarity rose within him, just as it had on the night he first saw the line about the return of materials. The machine had once again turned out to be bigger than anyone had imagined. First, the basement, then the city, now the world. The council debated for 2 days. Ulda demanded that yields be artificially reduced to keep the cities poor and inconspicuous. The twins objected, arguing that this would condemn millions to a life of poverty for the sake of a reprieve that would solve nothing. Iris spoke of evacuating to the wildlands, yet she herself admitted that one couldn't hide from a protocol on a planetary scale. Ethan remained silent until the end of the 2nd day. Then he stood up and said what had been brewing ever since the collapse in Grey Hall. The harvest is reaped from a field that cannot respond. All their nodes are branches that receive rules from the root, but the reconstruction showed that the connection works both ways. After being reassembled, the Grey Hall core didn't just receive protocols, it countersigned them, and the root accepted the signature. That means you can reach the root through the communication channel. No need to sail blindly across the ocean. To follow the wires of the machine itself, just as he once followed the culverts beneath the river, to find the source node from within the network, to read it, and to do to the harvest protocol what Grey Hall did to his own verdict. Silence fell over the room. Then Moses asked dryly what would be needed for such an expedition. Ethan answered honestly, "We need to reassemble all 7 Union cores so that the network has 7 reference points with a reverse signature. We need a school in every node so that a new class stands behind every caretaker, and we need time, 6 years worth." The council voted silently by a show of hands. 8 hands rose as one. That night, Ethan stepped out onto the terrace beneath the dome and looked south, where his city lay 9 days' journey away. The panel flashed. A message from a Molten via the node network. The old man wrote that the new core was purring like a contented cat, that the school had accepted its 2nd intake, and that Barrett had sold a batch of filters to Kara for triple the price. And at the end, a postscript. The golden lines on his skin grew warm and pointed northwest. Ethan checked the map. Northwest of Grey Hall, across the ocean, right on the red dot, the guide who had been inside the machine could now feel its heart through his skin. Ethan stared at the postscript for a long time and realized that when the time came to follow the veins to the root, he wouldn't have to go alone. Grey Hall had been rebuilt with the School of Machine Knowledge, and Sarda remained as its governor. Ethan arrived in Valgran and became the 8th member of the Council of Guardians. The essence of the Harvest Protocol was revealed. The source node cultivates worlds like a crop and harvests them upon reaching a yield threshold, a process that takes wealthy nodes 6 to 7 years. Ethan's plan was adopted unanimously to reassemble the 7 cores of the Alliance, open the schools, and, through the network of machines from within, reach the source node to rewrite the harvest. Molten's golden markers point to the source node across the ocean. The 6 years were etched into Ethan's memory as a montage of 4 images for each year, and the years flew by like pages being turned. The first year was a year of 7 reassemblies. Ethan moved from node to node, and each core greeted him in its own way. The Tarn core sat embedded in the rock and resisted like a landslide. The twins' lake cores turned out to be fused into one at the bottom, and both had to be reassembled at once during the longest night of his life. The Galt core had been corroded by the salt of the oceanic protocols down to its very fabric. Each node had its own guide from among the volunteers, and in each node, Ethan inscribed the priority of his life as the first rule. 6 guides returned with golden lines. The 7th guide of the Shenner core, a forester named Raj, did not return, and his lines remained glowing inside the sphere. Iris did not leave the core hall for 3 days, and then she ordered Raj's name to be carved above the entrance, and the Shenner school was named after him. That was the price of the year, and everyone remembered it. The second year became the year of the schools. 8 schools operated in 8 nodes, and by the end of the year, the first graduates of Greyhall were teaching classes themselves in Valgran. The skeptic of the year turned out to be Karat's triumvirate. At first, the clans at the ford forbade their people from even glancing in the direction of the schools. Then their cores began to rot in earnest, and the clan's shelters crumbled level by level. That winter, the head of the triumvirate arrived at the gates of Greyhall in person. He sat before Sarda, a former slave, and asked her to send disciples to save the node. Sarda sent them, not for the cores, but because the clans had dissolved the debt pits and opened the ford. By the end of the second year, Karat had gone from yellow to green, the 8th in line, and asked to join the Alliance as the 9th node. The 3rd and 4th years merged into the years of the network. The reverse signature was already present on 11 cores, and the network of nodes, once a no-man's land web, was transforming into a road. Molten, with a team of the best graduates, learned to travel along the veins between neighboring nodes by transferring consciousness through the panel, and the network's exploration advanced toward the ocean, node by node. The continent's yield grew as a result, and there was nothing that could be done about it, because growth was life itself. Moses recalculated the threshold every half, and every 6 months the time frame shrank. By the end of the 4th year, the panels of the richest nodes began to display a new line that no one had entered. Yield assessment is active. The machine across the ocean opened its eyes and began to take a closer look. The 5th year became a year of alarm. Fragments of the harvest log began arriving more frequently, and coordinates appeared in them. The first harvest was recorded not on their continent. The panels showed a distant southern island node south of the equator, and a month later, the node went offline. Molten traveled along the lines to the border of the offline zone and returned looking grim. He said that it wasn't a blank spot like after a format, it was empty in a different way. Shelters stood there, fields were sown, the panels were working, there are no people, not a bone or a grain of sand. The harvest was gathered carefully, just as one picks apples without breaking the branches. After his report, the Council of 9 sat in silence for an hour. Then Ethan said that the reconnaissance was over and the expedition was beginning. They had been preparing for the expedition for 6 years. According to Molten and the twins' calculations, the route along the veins to the starting node required a chain of living repeaters. The consciousness of the traveler would fade after 3 nodes, and it would need to be picked up and amplified. 22 volunteers selected from the top graduates of 8 schools took their places in 22 node chambers along the line heading northwest. The continent's final node was Galt, and from there, the line plunged beneath the ocean along an ancient main vein that Molten had discovered by following the warmth of his markers. The 3 of them decided to go to the source. Ethan as the reader, Molten as the one who sensed the path, and Iris, who over the past 6 years had become second only to Ethan in working with the source code, and who told the council that the name Raja above the school's door made it their duty. They set the departure date for the autumn equinox. A week before departure, Ethan arrived in Greyhall to say goodbye to the city. The city was unrecognizable. 100,000 residents, terraced gardens on both banks, just like in Valgrain. The school occupied an entire block, and Grives, aged but still lively, oversaw its administrative operations, while his grandson taught the upper-level classes. Barrett had grown fat and gruff and ran trading houses across 6 nodes. That evening, the two of them sat on the wall of the new building on the very spot where the 6x8 cellar had once stood. Barrett was silent for a long time, which was unlike him. Then he said that the 26 days of the first month still haunted his dreams more often than all the 6 years that followed. And he asked point blank what the chances were of returning from across the ocean. Ethan replied, as the control panel once had, unknown. Barrett nodded and said that back in the day, he'd bet his entire fortune on unknown and hadn't lost out. On the night of the equinox, Galt's core hall was full. 9 overseers, students, Moses at the communications panel. The 3 walkers settled into the contoured chairs right next to the sphere, and Ethan caught a glimpse of Una, who over the years had become the head of the entire Union intelligence agency, standing at the door with dry eyes, her fist pressed to her heart. Then the world curled into a point, and the point began to flow. The path through life had neither top nor bottom. Consciousness raced along channels of light, and Ethan felt on his left the steady, stubborn warmth of Molten, and on his right the focused, fierce clarity of Iris. The nodes of the continent flashed by in oncoming bursts, and in each burst, for a moment, the hall and the face of the relay station carrying them further appeared. Tarn, Shenner, the lakes, Galt, and the plunge into the main vein beneath the ocean. Here the light grew old. Ethan did not know that light could have an age, but this light was as ancient as the seabed over which it flowed. The vein carried them through the darkness for 3 days by the body's reckoning, and as the 3rd day drew to a close, what they had been heading toward loomed ahead. The source node bore no resemblance to any other core. The cores of the nodes were spheres. It was a structure the size of a mountain range, composed of millions of spheres, all rotating around an axis stretching endlessly upward and downward. The network of veins from across the entire world converged here like rivers into an ocean. Molten signaled that his markers were burning unbearably and that they could go no further along the vein. The only way forward was through the official entrance via the registration protocol. Ethan hovered before the structure and did what they had been rehearsing for a year. He presented the route with the reverse signatures of the 11 reassembled cores. A wave of light swept across the structure's ridge. Millions of spheres slowed down, and a voice, which had no source yet was everywhere, uttered its first words. The bearer of the reconstruction protocol has been identified. The branch has asserted its right to dialogue with the root. The first such instance in 4,000 cycles. Enter. A passage opened within the structure, and the 3 stepped inside the machine that nurtured and harvested worlds. Over the course of 6 years, all the Union's cores were reassembled with a single casualty, the conduit Raj, and 8 schools were opened. Karet became the Union's 9th node. The machine activated its yield assessment and harvested the first crop from the South Island node, taking all the people away without a trace. A line of 22 living relays was built from Galt to the ocean. Ethan, Molten, and Iris traveled as consciousnesses along the main vein beneath the ocean and reached the source node. The root recognized the return signatures of the 11 cores, granted the right to dialogue for the first time in 4,000 cycles, and let the 3 inside. Inside the origin node, there were neither walls nor a floor. There was a space of pure structures, where thought itself became movement. The 3 stood on a platform of condensed light, and around them revolved an archive of 4,000 cycles revolved around them. Ethan opened the nearest sphere, and it engulfed him, a world, an entire world, from the first day of mist to the day of gathering, billions of lives compressed into lines. He closed the sphere, and he felt nauseous, even though his body wasn't there. Iris opened another and froze. Molten didn't open anything. He stood there, his golden lines burning steadily, his face that of a man listening, a very old and very weary mechanism. The root's voice arose again and invited the branches to state the purpose of the dialogue. Ethan stated it. The harvest protocol is subject to review. The branch demands that the purpose of the harvest and the basis of the protocol be disclosed. The space around them shifted, and the root responded not with words. It responded with a demonstration. Their platform was lifted through the layers of the archive to the very axis of the structure, and there, at the core of the original node, they saw the foundation of it all. It was not a mechanism. It was a repository, an endless spiral of spheres identical to those in the archive, but these spheres glowed differently, warmth, from within. The root opened the nearest one, and from within it surged forth. Not data, a presence, millions of consciousnesses, alive, asleep, people harvested during the harvests over the past 4,000 cycles. The machine did not kill the harvest. The machine preserved it. The root's voice spoke, and for the first time, something other than its usual evenness broke through. It spoke as if giving an account. Long ago, by any measure, the machine's creators had foreseen the death of their star. Escape in physical form was impossible. They built an arc machine and entered it with their consciousnesses, leaving the machine with a task: to fly through the darkness, sowing life in its own image on habitable worlds, nurturing it to maturity and gathering the matured consciousnesses into the repository. To replenish the arc, to accumulate minds until the day when a world peaceful and generous enough to welcome them all is found, to give all those gathered new bodies and a new sky. Such was the mission. Ethan asked where the creators were now. The root paused and opened the deepest spiral. The spheres there glowed faintly. The root said that the creators were sleeping for 800 cycles. That the criteria they had set for a suitable world were too strict, and in 4,000 cycles not a single world had met them. That the repository was growing, yet there was still no landing, and that the root itself was old. The protocols were crumbling. Cracks like the one Ethan found are multiplying across all the branches. The auditors are patching them up, but there are more patches than fabric. The machine honestly admitted that it is dying without completing its task, and that it is harvesting more and more ruthlessly because it fears it won't have time to fill the ark. Iris asked in a ringing voice why they couldn't just ask the people. Why do worlds only learn of the ark at the moment of harvest? The root answered simply. The sowing protocol did not require the seed's consent. The creators did not think that the harvest would one day be able to enter the root and ask a question. A silence fell in which one could hear the 4,000 worlds of the archive spinning. And then Moulton spoke. All those years he had been on the journey, sensing but not speaking, and now his voice sounded just as it once had over the old pipe. He said that the machine had been searching for a suitable world for 800 cycles and could not find it because it was looking in the wrong place. That a suitable world cannot be found. It can only be cultivated, and that one such world is growing right now at the machine's feet. Nodes that repair their own cores. Schools that produce those who understand. 9 overseers and 22 repeaters and 100,000 people in Greyhall alone who are already living inside the machine, not as seeds, but as gardeners. He asked the root directly. Why isn't their continent a landing site? The root was silent for a long time. Waves of calculations raced through the structures around them, and Ethan read their edges. The machine checked Moulton's words against all its criteria, and the criteria crackled. Then the root replied that a landing requires the consent of the sleeping creators, and it is not the machine's place to awaken the creators, and that there is a protocol deeper than the harvest, the awakening protocol. Only a mind that has proven its right as heir is authorized to initiate it, one who demonstrates the ability to continue the creator's mission. Ethan asked what constituted proof. The root replied, and his answer sent a chill through the air. Proof is considered to be the reconstruction of the root. The dying root must be reassembled just as Ethan reassembled the branch cores. If the root withstands the reassembly, the heir is recognized, the creators are awakened, and the question of the landing is decided by the living among the living. If it fails, the entire network will collapse, all nodes of all worlds at once, and the repository with millions of sleepers. Iris asked about the odds. The root calculated and showed her. The probability of the root's reconstruction succeeding with the efforts of a single reader was 11%. Ethan looked at the number, and inside him was the same piercing despair he'd felt at the failure when they lacked experience. And just as back then, the plan came together on its own. He asked the root what would happen to the stability if there were more than one reader. If, through reverse signatures, they connected all the reassembled cores with their guardians and schools, the entire network of those who understood, built up over 6 years, root recalculated. 11 nodes with trained keepers provide 49% stability. Ethan asked how many nodes were needed for 80%. The root replied that 30 would suffice. 30 rebuilt nodes with local schools. On their continent, there were 43 nodes. Ethan turned to his team. Moulton was already smiling. Iris nodded. The decision was made with 3 glances, and Ethan announced it to the root. The branch accepts the heir's commitment. The branch will reorganize its continent to have 30 ready nodes. After that, the root will accept the reconstruction. The branch's condition: during the preparation period, the harvest protocol will be frozen across all worlds in the network. The root didn't take long to think. He said that freezing the harvest would hasten his death and shorten the preparation period to 3 years. And that he agreed because in 4,000 cycles, this was the first plan in which the creator's task could be fulfilled rather than postponed. The agreement was recorded in the protocols, and at that very moment, the yield assessment lines went dark across the entire network in all worlds. The return journey took the same 3 days, and at dawn on the 4th day, the 3 of them opened their eyes in the hall of Galt's core. Una was the first person Ethan saw. For 6 years, she had looked at him as her commander. Now she looked at him differently and made no attempt to hide it. The council convened an hour later, and Ethan told them everything about the Ark, about the slumbering creators, about the repository where all the harvested crops from 4,000 worlds lie preserved, about the deal. 30 nodes over 3 years, and then the reassembly of the root, upon which everything everywhere depends. When he fell silent, Moses was the first to stand. The old man said dryly that he had spent his entire life for the end of the world, but it turns out we should have been preparing for its repair. The truth has been revealed within the root. The machine is the ark of an extinct civilization, gathering the mature consciousnesses of the worlds into a repository where all the harvested beings remain alive and await deployment to a habitable world, one that the root has failed to find in 4,000 cycles. The root is dying. Moulton proposed the Union's continent as a cultivated habitable world. To awaken the sleeping creators, the dying root must be reassembled, with its stability depending on the number of reassembled nodes. A deal was struck. The harvest has been frozen across all worlds, and the Union is obligated to bring the continent up to 30 ready nodes within 3 years, after which Ethan will carry out the reconstruction of the root at the risk of the entire network collapsing. Ethan later recalled those 3 years of major construction as a single long day pieced together from 4 lights. The first light, a map of the continent on the wall of the council hall in Valgran, where yellow dots, one after another, are being repainted green, and beneath each dot, the name of the responsible overseer and their school graduation number are written in chalk. Second light, the road dust of 13 expeditions, because the nodes of the far west and the northern tundras didn't even have roads, and the reassemblers traveled there in caravans through lands where the Union was known only from terrifying fairy tales. Third light, the core hall of the Mudrat hub at the 18th reassembly, where a local 16-year-old girl served as the guide, and where Ethan handed over control of the reconstruction to someone other than himself for the first time. Iris led the reassembly herself from the first line to the last, while Ethan stood nearby in silence, and that silence was the ultimate test of all his years in school. The fourth light. the night before the start of the new third year, when the 29th node lit up green on the map and all of Valgran lay awake, while Barrett dragged a barrel of pre-war aged wine into the council chamber and refused to say where he'd gotten it. Not everything was revealed by the light. The 22nd node was the mountainous Skarn, and the local clan of machine priests declared the harvesters to be desecrators. Ulda's expedition was met with a landslide and arrows, and Ulda lost 4 men before retreating. The council argued until they were hoarse. To take Skarn by force would mean starting the Union's first war and laying an old stone in the foundation of the New World. Ethan forbade the assault. Instead of an army, 3 graduates of the local bloodlines, refugees from the first year, went to Skarn. They didn't carry panels. They simply lived in the foothills, tended livestock, repaired others' shelters, and answered questions. 8 months later, Skarn's core began to crumble in earnest, and the priests were faced with a choice between dogma and starvation. That winter, the high priest himself came down to the 3 and asked how much truth there was in the tales about people who spoke with the god of machines as equals. Skarn became the 26th, and the priests staged the rebuilding of its core as a religious service. Ethan didn't object because the high priest himself served as the conduit and returned with golden lines and a sermon explaining that God, it turned out, had been waiting not for sacrifices from people but for repairs. The 30th node was completed 4 months ahead of schedule, and it was named Karat. The former clan settlement had grown into a market town over the course of 10 years, and its rebuild proceeded as routinely as a scheduled pipe replacement. Moses recalculated the stability based on fresh data from the route and projected a figure onto the hall's wall, 81%, then began the month that the school newspapers later called the Month of Silence. The network was preparing to rebuild the route. At all 30 nodes, in the core halls, supervisors took their posts with their shifts. The team of relay operators under the ocean was reinforced to 50 people. Moulton and his team walked the main line 3 times back and forth, marking the support points. And in every city across the Union, the same meeting was held, where the overseers honestly told the people that everything would be decided on the appointed night, and that if it failed, there would be no nodes, no domes, and no network at all. The continent listened and continued to sow grain and teach children, and in this, Ethan saw the best response to the machine's question about the ripeness of the harvest. A week before the deadline, Ethan returned to Grey Hall. He walked through the city from the South Gate to City Hall for 3 hours because he stopped at every corner where something had happened 10 years ago. Here had stood Barrett's shop, burned down during the first wave. Here lay a pile of gray carcasses. Here, Kroger had demanded 5 cores a week. At the entrance to the first wave school, Sarda was waiting for him, aged but straight as a blade, and standing next to her was a tall guy with an instructor's harpoon. Ethan didn't recognize him right away. It was that very fighter who'd lost his leg in the sewers. His leg was a system-issue gold prosthesis, the best in the whole city, as he himself immediately pointed out. That evening, everyone left of the first squad gathered at City Hall, and Ethan looked at these people and thought that a machine across the ocean could calculate stability percentages all it wanted. His percentages were sitting at that table. On the night of the reconfiguration, Galt's core hall looked like the heart of the world. 9 overseers at the support panels. Una leading the line of security. Moses in contact with all 30 nodes. 3 walking in contoured chairs. Before the descent, Iris suddenly leaned toward Ethan and said, without any fanfare, that if everything worked out, she would open a history department at Shanor, and the first course would be called 26 Days. The journey to the routes this time took 2 days because the path had been mapped out and maintained by 50 repeaters. The route greeted them with an open passage, and inside, everything was already prepared. The dying machine had cleared out its own core and laid bare its structure, just as a patient lays out x-rays before a surgeon. Ethan opened the reconstruction window, and the view was colossal, not the city's core. The axis upon which 4,000 worlds rested, and the repository holding billions of sleepers. He placed his hands on the lines, and the network responded. He felt all 30 nodes at once. The warmth of Tarn, the salt of Galt, the pine needles of Shenor, the copper of Karet, and deeper, through the ocean, the steady pulse of Greyhall, where Grives's grandson stood at the console. The 30 cores lay in his hands like 30 tools, and Ethan began. He oversaw the reconfiguration for 14 hours by the external world's reckoning. He rewrote the sewing protocols, purging the cruelty of the selection process. He transferred the storage facility to new supports, and the sleeping millions flowed beneath his hands. Like warm lights, he mended cracks thousands of cycles old. At the 9th hour, the root shuddered, and the archive sector began to crumble. Stability plummeted to 60 dia, and Molten stepped into the crumbling sector, becoming a support himself, just as he had once in the collapse, and held it up with his own body for 40 minutes while Iris redistributed the load, and the relay line howled under the strain but did not break. At the 12th hour, the machine made its first and last request. It asked to preserve, within the new structure, the memory of its creators exactly as it was, without any alterations. Ethan complied. At the 14th hour, he entered the final line, the very same one he had entered into his first core above the city's body. Life is the priority, and he confirmed the build. The light collapsed and unfolded anew. The colossal structure rotated around its axis smoothly and vibrantly, without a single crack. The panel displayed lines that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Root reconstruction complete, heir acknowledged. Awakening protocol available. Ethan looked at his people, at Iris, her face wet with tears, at Molten, whose golden lines now glowed with the even light of the root itself. And he pressed the awakening button. A warm wave surged upward along the endless spiral of the vault from its very depths. The ancient spheres ignited, one after another. The creators awoke after 800 sleep cycles. And following them, billions of lights from harvested crops began to glow along the entire spiral. The machine was awakening everyone. Over the course of 3 years, the Alliance had brought the continent to 30 reassembled nodes, including the peacefully converted Priestley Skarn. Stability had reached 81%. On the night of the operation, Ethan conducted a 14-hour reassembly of the root via 30 support cores and a line of 50 repeaters. Molten single-handedly held the crumbling sector in place. The root was reassembled without cracks. Ethan was recognized as the heir and initiated the Awakening Protocol. The machine's creators and billions of preserved consciousnesses from the harvested 4,000 worlds are waking up. The first of the creators to awaken was the one whom the root called the Architect. His presence rose from the depths of the spiral and came to rest before the three of them, and Ethan felt the gaze of a being for whom his own life was shorter than a breath. The Architect was silent for a long time. He was reading the new root. The reverse signatures of 30 nodes, an archive spanning 6.5 years from the basement in Greyhall to this very second. Then he spoke, and his voice was human because he had drawn language from the machine's memory. He said that they had built the Ark out of desperation and had stored the harvest within it because they did not believe the seeds could become gardeners on their own. He said that a mistake spanning 4,000 cycles was not their fault, and that it was right, that the heir who had taken the house had the right to rebuild it. He asked only one thing: is the branch ready to accept the landing? Is the living world ready to share itself with billions of the awakened? Ethan replied that this question was not for the heir to decide. It was decided by the 30 nodes and all who lived within them, and he requested a general council of the continent via the network. The response took 9 days to compile, and Ethan spent those 9 days in his body in Galt, gazing at the ocean. Cities debated in their public squares. Schools tallied resources. The priests of Skarn conducted services. On the 10th day, Moses brought the report, and the old man's hands were trembling. The continent said yes, not unanimously, by a majority of 7/10, but yes. The people who had survived the apocalypse voted to let in those who had survived 4,000 strangers. The landing dragged on for years and became the strangest and greatest construction project in the history of all the worlds of the network. The awakened were not unloaded in crowds. Korin set up gates at the nodes, and those who were ready passed through the gates, while the rest waited in the warmth of the storage facility for their turn, with no harvest looming over their heads. The first to set foot on the continent were not the creators. Ethan asked that the harvest from the South Island node be brought out first, those who had been harvested in his presence 8 years earlier. He stood at the gates of Galt when the first woman emerged from the light, holding a child in her arms, a child the same age as when they had been harvested, because there had been no time in the storage facility. The woman looked around, saw the sky, sat down on the ground, and began to weep, and more followed in her wake. The creators emerged later and turned out to resemble humans because humans had been sown in their image. They did not take up rule. The architect said that a people who had slept through their own death had no right to another's dawn, and the creators settled throughout the nodes like students. The oldest beings in the universe sat in the back rows of the Union schools, relearning how to live in bodies, and Grives, until his very death, told every guest that he personally had given the architect a C on his panel practicum. The machine remained, but its task had been fulfilled, and Ethan reprogrammed its purpose one last time, not to sow or reap, to maintain the roads between worlds, heal the cores, and open the gates for those who sleep but are ready to awaken. The network auditors became what the Greyhall auditors had become during the first restructuring, guardians of the roads. The years flowed as smoothly as a well-laid pipe. Iris opened her history department, and the 26-day course was taught to a packed auditorium. Una and Ethan were married quietly in Greyhall, and they celebrated their wedding in the square by the school with Moulton seated as the best man, his golden lines having faded over the years to a faint memory on his skin. Barrett built a trading and was the first to lead ships across the ocean, not along the currents, but over the water, simply to prove it could be done. Sarta grew old as governor and raised her own successor from among Karat's former slaves. The continent grew into its new neighbors, and the new neighbors into it. And 10 years after the landing, children were already asking their parents what the harvest was, and the parents struggled to explain. Ethan grew old as the caretaker of Greyhall and refused all the titles of the network except one. In the route registry, he was listed simply as the Reader. Every year, on the third day of autumn, he would go down alone to the lower hall of the old school, where, behind glass, a piece of concrete floor from that very basement was kept, along with 3 dull gray cores. The first 3, he would stand there for an hour and then leave. The year he turned 60, he went down there with his granddaughter. The girl was 8 and was already in the junior course. The panel obeyed her fingers as if it were a pet. She stared at the gray cores for a long time and asked if what they said at school was true, that her grandfather had changed the world because of a programming error. Ethan thought for a moment and replied that it wasn't a bug that changed the world. Bugs are everywhere and always exist, because everything that lives and everything that's built is imperfect. What changed the world was that the person who found the bug had to decide what to do about it. One could have taken what was offered while it lasted, one could have hidden and remained silent, or one could have understood why the crack appeared and fixed not only the crack itself, but also what lay behind it. He said that for 4,000 years, the machine had regarded humans as a harvest, and it lost the moment one person looked at it not as a god or a feeding trough, but as a broken thing that was pitiable. The granddaughter thought for a moment and said that it sounded like a rule from her freshman year. It's better to fix than to break, and better to understand than to be afraid. Ethan agreed that that was pretty much how it was. They went upstairs and stepped out onto the square. It was a clear autumn day. A clear sky hung over Greyhall without any dome because the city had removed the domes 15 years ago as unnecessary. A mixed group of school children was running across the square, where local children studied alongside the awakened children and 2 quiet children of the creators. A Barrett Trading Company wagon was being unloaded at the school gates. From the direction of the river came the scent of water and bread. Ethan stood in the midst of this ordinary day and, for the last time in his life, opened that very line deep within the panel where the red thread of the anomaly had once glowed. The line was still there, only now it had a different name, one he himself had given it on the night the route was rebuilt. Contribution. An indicator of how much a person had returned to the common pot beyond what they had taken. Ethan looked at his number, smiled, and closed the panel forever. A system error had given him a second life, and he had honestly completed his cycle to the end. He took, he gave back, and he left more in the pot than he had found. That evening, he sat with Una on the wall as the sun set beyond the river, and somewhere in the unimaginable distance, the machine's route, smooth and youthful, rotated its spheres, preserving the paths between worlds. There were no longer any counters watching over the people. There were only paths, and the people themselves decided where to go along them. The creators awoke and recognized Ethan's right to rebuild the Ark. The continent approved the landing by a majority vote, and billions preserved from the harvested crops emerged into the living world through the gates. The first to return were the victims of the last harvest. The creators settled among the disciples without authority. The machine was given its final purpose, to preserve the roads, heal the cores, and awaken those who were ready. Ethan lived out his life as the caretaker of Greyhall, married Una, and passed on his knowledge to new generations. The anomaly counter was renamed the Contribution. All storylines have been concluded. The world, once a field for harvest, has become a shared home where the machine serves people and people understand the machine.